let me invite our first plenary speaker, Professor Donald Winford from Ohio State. Professor, please join us. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can I get a glass of water, please? Sure. Right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming out so early on a Saturday morning in this weather. Thanks very much to Piotr and to Anna, who emailed me faithfully, and to all concerned for inviting me here. My first visit to Poland. There's a handout, and I don't know if it has gone around yet, but I'll kind of be depending on that because there's no way I'm going to say all that I want to say, and I hope you can follow it. So,
excuse me, I think all of you have handouts, first of all in the Book of Abstracts and in your in the materials in the bag that you got.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the parallels between Creole formation and second language acquisition. Parallels that were noted, in fact, as early as the 19th century by scholars like Hessling and later Jespersen. There's now a growing consensus among Creolists that Creole formation, in fact, represents a special type of naturalistic second language acquisition. And so it therefore shares a lot in common with other kinds of SLA. In the first place, it's been argued that the early stages of Creole formation and SLA share processes of simplification and other kinds of restructuring, to the point that, as Prof put it, the early L2 learner and the early Creole co-creator are cognitively and epistemologically indistinguishable. Schumann, back in '78, suggested that the early stages of both types of acquisition involved a pigeonization process. And there's now, as we know, abundant evidence that the same kinds of simplification operating in the early stages of SLA also operate in the early stages of Creole formation. And I'll be talking about that very briefly in a minute. In the second place, researchers also agree that L1 transfer plays some role in both of these types of acquisition. But they acknowledge that the developmental paths taken by Creoles diverge in varying degrees from those that are taken by developing L2 systems or interlanguage systems. Siegel points out then, if SLA was involved in the genesis of Creoles, that raises the key question of why acquisition did not progress further in the case of Creoles. In other words, why Creoles did not continue along the developmental continuum to become more like their lexifier languages. And Creolists explain that divergence in terms of two things. First, the fossilization of simplified structure in Creoles, and secondly, the pervasiveness and persistence of L1 transfer in Creoles by contrast with L2 development. Now this debate, for all of us who are interested in SLA, raises issues similar to those that have been discussed in that literature, particularly with respect to the competing roles of transfer and universal grammar in SLA. We know that back in the 90s, people like Bickerton argued that Creole grammar arose from the operation of an innate language by a program. And that position aligns itself with those SLA researchers who argue for the so-called full access model, which claims that UG in its entirety constrains L2 acquisition. And they, of course, assign little on a role to transfer. On the other hand, in another camp, researchers have argued for the full transfer, full access model, which claims that the initial state of L2 acquisition is in fact the L1, which transfers in its entirety. And that position in SLA is reflected in the Creole literature in the relexification model of Creole genesis that was first proposed by Lefebvre and Lumsden. So my goal in this paper is to assess the claims made about these parallels or lack of them between SLA and Creole formation with respect first to the processes of simplification in the early stages of acquisition, and then secondly with respect to the role of transfer in the restructuring of the respective interlanguage systems. Now, Pearman's position, with which I'm taking issue here, objects to the full transfer model of SLA And he objects especially to McWhinney's view that the early second language learner should in fact experience a massive amount of transfer from L1 to L2. I'm going to argue that in fact Creole formation provides strong support for the full transfer model. Now my point of departure is Ingo Plagg's formulation of what he calls the interlanguage hypothesis, which states that Creoles are conventionalized interlanguages of an early stage. The term conventionalized here is simply meant to capture the fact that Creoles are ultimately the result of community-based processes of leveling and stabilization of a common grammar, as distinct from the interlanguage processes that operate in the mind of the individual learner. And it's these psycholinguistic processes that I'm really more interested in today. The IL hypothesis, in fact, is concerned only with those psycholinguistic processes. Now, Plagg's discussion of the parallels between early interlanguage in SLA and Creoles draws heavily on Pieneman's processability theory, and that in turn is based on psycholinguistic models of language production, such as that proposed by Level. So I'm going to try to cram all of these ideas together and go through each of them very fast for you and try to make connections among them. So the basic premise of processability theory is that, quote, the task of acquiring a language includes the acquisition of the procedural skills needed for the processing of the language. And its chief claim, the chief claim of PT, is that the acquisition of L2 language processing procedures follows a strict implicational sequence in which each procedure is a necessary prerequisite for the following procedures. And that hierarchy is shown on page 1 of your handout. If you could appeal to that, take a look at it. And if you could look at page 2 real quickly, Pieneman offers there an explanation of the hierarchy. So it's a very, very strong claim that SLA will proceed according to this sequence. Well, those predictions have in fact been tested and to some extent confirmed by studies of the acquisition of various L2s in the work of Pieneman and his associates. Now, processability theory, as I just said, builds on the model of language production described first in Level 1989, which is actually a model of monolingual language production. And it assumes that language generation follows the kind of procedure shown on figure 1 on page 2 of your handout, very, very roughly. Some of the basic premises here are pretty vital to what I want to say later on, so I'll go through them really quickly. First of all, Level tells us grammatical encoding takes a message as input, retrieves lexical items from the mental lexicon, and then delivers a surface structure as output. Now, the lexical retrieval process itself, this is kind of central to my whole argument, first involves accessing the lemmas associated with the relevant lexical item, and second, selecting that item's form specification, or lexeme, as it's stored in the mental lexicon. Now, crucially, lemmas contain information about the semantic, syntactic, and other grammatical properties of the lexical item in question. And the crucial premise of the model is that lexical selection drives grammatical encoding. In other words, the lexicon is an essential mediator between conceptualization and grammatical encoding. Now, that's an idea that's pretty common in the study of syntax anyhow. So lemmas activate or trigger syntactic procedures that correspond to their syntactic specifications. A verb will trigger construction of a VP, a noun, the construction of an NP, and so on. And an example of that is shown in figure 1, which is on page 3 of your handout. And I'm going to use this figure real quickly just to focus on what's going on under what's labeled there as interphrasal information exchange and intraphrasal information exchange, which actually involves the role of inflectional morphology in the syntax. And I'll show really quickly that that model is in fact quite relevant to acquisition of L2 inflectional morphology and to what goes on in Creoles where you lack these kinds of inflectional morphology. So processability theory, remember, predicts that in second language acquisition, there'll be a certain sequence of acquisition. And as far as morphology is concerned, the sequence is from lexical to phrasal to interphrasal types of morphology. And Plagg then, to his credit, uses processability theory to show why Creoles are characterized by lack of inflectional morphology, as well as by sentence structures that are of the most basic elementary type that are invariant. I'm just going to skip through that really quickly. For a point of departure, you can look at Table 2, which is on pages 3 to 4 of your handout. And that's the model for the development of English inflectional as well as syntactic procedures in regular SLA, according to Pieneman 2000. And I'm concerned just with the first couple of stages there where early word order is set and where morphology starts to come into play. You can see that plural marking, for example, emerges quite early at stage 2 of that process, but NP agreement, that intraphrasal agreement, as well as subject-verb agreement, which is interphrasal, emerge much later and later than each other at stages 3 and 5 respectively. I'm sorry? Oh. Is somebody timing me, by the way?
I am.
Okay, so you can tell me every 10 minutes or so. How much do I have, 40 minutes?
Yeah, no, 35.
35? Okay, I'll try to do it. Okay, so Plagg takes all of this as evidence then that the emergence of inflection in Creoles follows a similar developmental path as in early interlanguage, but it's constrained by the fact that the processing procedures necessary for its emergence have not yet been acquired. And I'll refer you to the work by Plagg because I think it's an excellent demonstration of why Creoles, seeing that he calls them fossilized early interlanguage stages, don't develop those kinds of inflectional morphology. So I agree completely with his account of what he calls the process of simplification in early IL as well as Creole formation, which other people had referred to before. Now, having said that, I mean, there are limitations to this so-called interlanguage hypothesis, right? Because the explanation Plagg offers really cannot account for the vast majority of Creole grammar, and particularly the emergence of things like tense-mood aspect systems, right, in the morphosyntax, and for a broad range of sometimes quite complex syntactic structures. And those are the things that I'm more concerned about today. So I'm concerned then with the limitations not just of the IL hypothesis, but by extension of processability theory as an explanation for the development of Creole grammar as a whole. And this is a limitation, by the way, that Plagg himself acknowledges. It's precisely the later stages of Creole development, which Plagg doesn't deal with at all, that challenge the assumed parallels between SLA and Creole formation. As Kuenberg points out in her 2006 paper, the persistent influence of L1 transfer beyond the point of target shift constitutes a striking contrast between L2 acquisition and creolization. That's what sets Creoles apart. And that therefore raises some serious questions about how far psycholinguistic approaches to SLA, such as processability theory, can account for the development of Creole grammar beyond those early stages. Now, as far as transfer in Creole formation and SLA is concerned, there's a huge literature on that. And in both camps, researchers have very different views on the extent to which L1 transfer plays a role in the restructuring of learners' systems. With regard to Creole formation, the relexification hypothesis of Lefebvre and her associates easily constitutes the strongest claim about L1, that is substrate influence, on the emergence of Creole grammar. They, if you recall, equate the relexification hypothesis with the full transfer, full access model of SLA as proposed by Schwartz and Sprouse and Lydia White, among others. And Lefebvre et al. Point out, to quote them, both relaxification theory and the full transfer, full access model posit transfer such that the L1 effectively is the interlanguage grammar, or is the Creole grammar. So it's a really very strong kind of claim. But at the same time, they acknowledge that transfer perseveres much longer in the case of Creoles than in SLA, where, as you know, its effects become less and less pronounced as acquisition proceeds. However, the view that both early SLA and Creole formation are shaped by full transfer from learners' L1s contrasts very sharply with the position taken by Pieneman and his associates. They totally reject the idea that the L1 formulator can be bulk transferred at the initial stage. And they argue instead that the learner will construct the formulator of the L2 from scratch. And their position is based squarely on the premise that, to quote them, L1 transfer is developmentally moderated and will occur only when the structure to be transferred is processable within the developing L2 system. Now, consider that very carefully, because it's a crucial key to how they view this implicational hierarchy of acquisitional sequences. And that's why they argue that structures higher up the processability hierarchy are never transferred at the initial state. Well, to some extent, there's evidence to support their view, because there are cases where L1 transfer will only come into play at a certain stage of interlanguage development. And I refer you to the work of Nemser, for example, who shows that there are different kinds of transfer from German into L2 English that depend on the level of proficiency that the learner has reached in the L2. And there's some examples of that on page 5 of your handout, examples 1 and 2 and so on, which illustrate that it's only when you have actually acquired rules of subcategorization for verbs like suggest or finish and so on, that the potential for transfer from the German becomes strong. So I'm not disputing that aspect of Pieneman's claim. These examples do seem to support the processability theory view of L1 transfer in SLA. But these, remember, are based on cases where learners have continued access to the target language, and they have sufficient input from that target to continually revise their interlanguage grammar so that it approximates the TL grammar more and more. And that is precisely where Creole formation differs drastically from SLA. Because in general, Creole creators have little access to the superstrate language, in other words, the putative L2. And as a consequence, they have little input from it on which to construct closer approximations to that grammatical system. In fact, in most cases, their input from the so-called superstrate comes from a grammatically impoverished pidgin or some simplified contact variety. That's their target. And so as a consequence, they have to build components of Creole grammar by drawing primarily on their L1 knowledge, as well as other universally motivated strategies. So it follows that the tenets of PT, processability theory, cannot apply to Creole formation in the same way that they apply to second language acquisition, if indeed they apply at all. And it's particularly difficult to see how the processability theory prediction that only those linguistic forms that the learner can process can be transferred to the L2 could possibly apply in a situation of restricted access to the target language. So notice about this claim that learners have to first acquire the necessary L2 procedures before they can process and incorporate L1 structures or forms as part of their developing L2 system. But in Creole formation, there's no opportunity in the first place to acquire L2 procedures at higher levels of the processability hierarchy. So how can this model possibly hold of that kind of acquisition? Okay? Well, that's the question that I want to approach now. How then do Creole creators develop the necessary processing procedures that allow them to communicate fully in the developing interlanguage? And the answer to that must lie in the fact that in Creole formation, the L1 grammar is indeed fully accessible and available to learners. Now, Peterman and et al. Predict, in fact, that in SLA, when the hierarchy of procedures is cut off for a particular learner, the rest of that hierarchy will be replaced by a direct mapping of conceptual structures onto surface form. I'm quoting them here, as long as there are lemmata that match the conceptually instigated searches of the lexicon. Now, that seems to me to be a curious version of universals, right? So that if you lack the necessary procedures which to build your interlanguage grammar, instead of appealing to your L1, they say you appeal to some universal principle where you map conceptual structure directly onto whatever lexical items and their lemmas are available to you in the first place. And I don't know that anybody has demonstrated that for either SLA or for Creole formation. So instead, I'm going to argue, and this is something that is quite familiar to Creolists, that Creole creators make up for such lack of access to the L2 by applying the processing procedures of their L1, in addition to appealing to some universal strategies. And to better understand the restructuring of Creole grammar and how it differs from the restructuring of interlanguage grammar in SLA, we need to take a closer look at the psycholinguistic models of language production to which processability theory appeals. So on page 5 of your handout, I offer Level's original model. It's actually as amended by Bloch and Levelt in 1994. And I just invite you to take a look at that. Right? The idea is that we go through certain stages in producing our language. The first step of which is lexical selection, that involves identifying whatever lexical concepts and lemmas that are suitable for conveying the message. And lemmas, or if you prefer lemmata, contain information about the selected lexical concepts, such as their semantics, their form class membership, their grammatical properties, and so on. And it is that information, these lemmas, that activate or trigger syntactic processes that correspond to their syntactic specifications. So simply, I mean, a verbal construct or trigger construction of a verb phrase, a preposition, the construction of a prepositional phrase, and so on. And all of that depends simply on, what information is stored in the lemma of that particular verb or preposition or what have you. Okay. So I'm arguing that lemma access, in fact, is fundamental to the kinds of cross-linguistic transfer that occur in bilingual language mixture. That's why I'm putting so much emphasis on this aspect of the model for now. Real quickly, a second step in functional processing is function assignment. That involves assigning syntactic or grammatical functions such as subject nominative, object accusative, and so on to relevant lexical concepts. So part of the strategy we go through when we construct some utterance is that we assign subject and object and other kinds of functions based on the thematic role that's relevant to whatever lexical item we select. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but you can ask me about it, right, as we go along. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind here is that, and this is just one example of this process, the centrality of the verb to the organization of clause and sentence production is a crucial point that allows us to explain many cases of L1 transfer. And I'm going to return to that point very briefly below. You have an example on page 6 of your handout of how functional processing works, and I invite you to take a look at that to see what's going on in the generation of a sentence, where on the one hand you have assignment of thematic roles and their corresponding syntactic functions like subject, object, and so on. On the other hand, you have positional processing, which sets up the constituent assembly of your utterance and results in fixed word order patterns and things like that. How am I doing for time? Okay. Now, the model of language production that I just described for you, as I said, is a model of monolingual production. And it has been modified to fit bilingual speech production, and particularly the kinds of mixture that occur in bilingual speech. I'm going to skip over that real quickly because of time constraints, but if you look at page 7 of your handout, you'll see some of the things that need to be adjusted in the monolingual model that would make it amenable to the task of explaining bilingual language production. And those aspects of bilingual speech, the fact that you can use your two systems independently of each other, or you may mix them in different ways. They influence each other in different ways. And bilingual speakers may have different degrees of proficiency in each system. And then interactions can take place between the languages, whether they're typologically similar or not. Those are the crucial things that we need to keep in place. Now, the point that is most relevant to my present concern is a really insightful observation by Kees de Boot about what happens in a lot of bilingual speech production. As he puts it, and this quote is on your handout, I think, it is clear that when the speaker has very little knowledge of the L2, he can still make utterances in that L2 by making some internal extensions to the L1 system. In this way, it's plausible to think that it is only the morphophonological information for lexical items in the L2, which is L2 specific, while syntactic information from the L1 translation equivalent is activated. In other words, it's quite possible that a bilingual or a learner who is less proficient in the L2 will simply pick out phonological forms or lexemes from the L2. And if they have no clue about the lemmas associated with them, in other words, about their syntactic property, they will simply transfer the properties of the equivalent, the translation equivalent, from their L1. And that is what transfer is basically all about, at least at this level. So faced with that need to produce utterances in an L2 with which they are not familiar, learners will resort to L1 knowledge and L1 procedures. That's the simple point that I'm trying to make. And one solution, they adopt many different solutions, but one solution in particular that they adopt is to attach an L2 lexeme, just a phonological shape, to an L1 lemma as an alternative phonological shape. And interestingly, even Pieneman acknowledges that this goes on in SLA. I'll quote him, if the L2 word is simply attached to the L1 lemma as an alternative morphophonological form, then the complete L1 syntactic information would be available upon accessing the lemma. Is that 15 minutes left or 15 minutes gone? Left? Oh, okay. All right, I can do this. All right. And interestingly, what I just quoted there is essentially the very same explanation for L1 transfer that is assumed by adherents of the relexification hypothesis and of the full access, full transfer model of SLA. So Sprouse, in a 2006 paper, suggests, and I'll quote directly, the only way for the abstract properties of the L1 to transfer and comprise the initial state of L2 acquisition is via retention of the L1 lexicon, minus phonetic labels. That is, full transfer's abstract properties appear to correspond in minimalist terms to relexification's lexical features minus the phonetic features. So he's saying exactly the same thing that Pieneman has just said. So it would seem then, a logical conclusion, that both Creole creators and L2 learners, at least to some extent, can transfer abstract features of their L1 to the L2 that they are attempting to produce. Just that Creole creators do it a lot more. Now what I want to argue, and I'm going to skip this one too very quickly as well, is that the mechanism, the psycholinguistic mechanism by which they accomplish this transfer is what Van Cutsem calls imposition. And I have interpreted that mechanism to refer simply to the use of L1 processing procedures in producing an L2. It's a simple definition. So I've talked, a lot about imposition in the past, and I'm not going to bore you with it here again. For those of you in SLA, the term is practically equivalent to what Jeff Siegel calls functional transfer, right? Where he treats it also as a psycholinguistic mechanism for transferring L1 features into the L2. Okay, so quickly then, in imposition, the speaker as agent is linguistically dominant in the source language. That is, the language that's the source of the transfer. And he transfers features of that into his or her version of the recipient language via what Van Cutsem calls SL agentivity, as for example in the case of a French speaker using his French articulatory habits while speaking English. And if you apply that simple insight to the case of Creole formation, and even to cases of second language acquisition that have been documented by Helmspark and other people, you see that it actually explains many of the phenomena that have been ascribed to transfer in SLA literature or to substrate influence by Creolists. So when access to the L2 is restricted, or if the L2 input consists only of highly simplified structures, pigeonized varieties and the like, as is the case in Creole formation, then obviously learners cannot have full access to L2 lemmas. And they fall back on L1 lemmas to supply the information that's necessary for them to initiate more complex syntactic procedures. And this is where we come back to the idea then that it's the lemmas, the information, the lexical entries, if you like, associated with verbs and other heads of phrases that are crucial in determining what actually is produced by way of an output, a syntactic output. So in Creole formation then, it's the learner's L1 as the dominant language that controls the language production process at the level of what Level calls the formulator. And it therefore determines things like subcategorization and consequently constituent assembly procedures in the output, in the production of the L2. And for imposition to take place, for this mechanism to be triggered in these cases, all we really need is for learners to have access to the semantics of an L2 lexical item, and of course its general phonetic shape, right? Semantic congruence will trigger all kinds of other syntactic transfer as well. The reason is that similarity between the L2 item and a corresponding L1 item creates the basis for analogy. And so what I'm arguing here, in fact, is that all of these cognitive processes ultimately depend not on universals of the formal Chomskyan type, but on universals of cognitive processing, right? Of which analogy is one of the central components, as you know. I've given you a number of examples of what's going on in Creoles, and I realized that I put my data last because I wanted to get the argument and the premises out there first, right? So if we look at some of the examples, we could multiply these for Creoles all over the place. In example 3 from Saint Thomé Creole, I'm not going to try to read that, but you have, as you can see, there a word by word, right? Parallel equivalence between Saint Tomé, the Creole, and Edo, which is its substrate language. They run enter house, they ran into the house. Now the general thing that's going on there is that in both Edo and other West African languages that played a role in the formation of Saint Tomé, verbs of movement or transport are subcategorized for agent and patient arguments, as well as for an adjunct phrase that's introduced by a directional serial verb that indicates the direction of movement. So I'm treating all of this, in fact, as part of the property of the verb as head. That this is its subcategorization frame, and it must be satisfied. And all that the Creole creator, in this case, needs is the item coller and the meaning run, right? And this immediately assigns it all of the information that's available for Rure, which is the Edo equivalent, right? Different phonological shape, but identical lemma, identical subcategorization and everything. And this is all that the learner needs in order to supply the missing information, right? That allows him or her to create a sentence, an utterance like 3. So in the process of producing the incipient Creole utterance, Edo speakers simply impose the lemmas of verbs like Rure onto superstrate lexemes such as coller. And that triggers generation of a structure such as the one in 3, which has, as you see, the same constituency as its Edo counterpart. And there are other examples like that. I don't know if I have time for them, but I invite you to, 5 minutes is not enough time, so I'm going to just invite you to take a look at, for those of you, for example, into Caribbean Creoles, there's some examples from Slanang, Dongo, whose substrate are the Bay languages, and you have examples like 6 and 7 on your handout, and 8 and 9, and those respectively show complementation involving the serial verb meaning say or talk, right? And the structure is identical in the Creole to what it is, word for word, to what it is in the substrate language. And how can that come about if, as Pieneman claims, you are constrained by the processing ability that you have developed in the L2 in the first place? For those of you who are into regular SLA, I give some examples on page 8 of your handout of cases that I'm sure you've heard if you ever taught Spanish, where people impose English, for example, on their Spanish L2. So you get things like se lo dio para atrás instead of se lo volvió or devolvió, as you would get in standard Spanish. Or you get things like yo gusto eso, for I like that, instead of Spanish a mí me gusta eso, and so on. And I've tried to show you very briefly how all that's going on there is that the functional properties, meaning the subcat properties of English-like, are in fact substituted for those of gustar in Spanish. Am I out of time? So real quickly in conclusion, I just want to say that I hope this discussion lends to support to the suggestion that in both SLA and Creole formation, the learner's L1 plays an active role in shaping acquisition of the target language, or in psycholinguistic terms, is fully activated in the process of producing the L2. And that's what explains all of these similarities between SLA and Creole formation that we talked about. And the extent and nature of the L1 transfer in particular challenges the claim that Pieneman makes that transfer can only take place when L1 structures can be processed by the IL system. If that were true, Creoles would never have been created in the first place. Thank you.